So we're talking about the Haftorah of the portion of Emor. Emor really has two parts. The beginning of the parsha speaks a lot about the laws and the specific regulations for the Kohanim, for the priest, primarily who they're allowed to marry, and the laws of becoming impure. They're not supposed to become impure unless it's a very close relative. And if it's the high priest, he's got even more restrictions of who he can marry, and he's not allowed to become impure for anybody, even a relative, even a close relative. He can't go to the funeral. And then we have some laws about the priests in the temple. That's the first half of the parsha and this first half of the portion. And then the second half of the portion is really to the collective Jewish people. It focuses on the laws of the holidays, as we will discuss, God willing, tomorrow in good health. So when we turn to the Haftorah, there's a Haftorah also dedicated to the Kohanim, the priests. But it's dedicated, it's referring to the priests in the future, in the time of the Mashiach. So we're going to read from the book of Yechezkel. And the book of Yechezkel talks about, he lives at the end of the destruction of the first temple and beginning of the exile. And Yechezkel, Ezekiel, talks about the restoration during the redemption. But while Isaiah talks mostly about what's going to happen in Israel, Isaiah does mention the temple, but not as much as Ezekiel, not as much as Yechezkel. In the vision of Yechezkel, he spends a lot of time in the part of the prophecies that talk about the redemption to discuss the building and the construction and the exact location and the service in the temple. And we believe it's the third temple because the second temple was not built based on the dimensions in the book of Ezekiel. The third temple, God willing, in the immediate future, will be built based on the dimensions of the book of Yechezkel. So that's the context. So after you have Ezekiel talking about the redemption in the context of rebuilding the temple, and he talks about that for a while, now he starts talking about the people who are going to serve on the temple, namely the Kohanim, the priests, and specifically a specific family, Bnei Tzadok, the children of Tzadok, as we will see. This is a family that remained loyal to God throughout the period of the first temple, and therefore their descendants will serve in the third temple. So that's the sort of context of this Haftorah that we talk about, just like the Parsha talks about the laws of the Kohanim, the laws of the priests. So the Haftorah talks about the role of the priests in the future temple, and you have a lot of some degree of regulation. Again, who they can marry and what do they do, and what's the unique customs of the priests are. And in that sense, it's a very simple Haftorah. So if you want to check out now, you could, because here comes the complicating part. The complicating part, of course, is that, not of course, but the complicating part is that a lot of things in this Haftorah seem to contradict what the Torah says. Sometimes small contradictions, sometimes big contradictions. So that's a problem of the Haftorah. And in general, we discussed this in the past also, that at some point the rabbis decided, we're going to bury the book of Ezekiel because there's too many things in Ezekiel that contradict the Torah. And then they spoke about one rabbi who says, give me oil. He took 300 barrels of oil so he can have fuel for his candle. And he went up to the attic and he interpreted the entire book and everything makes sense. And no need to bury the book of Ezekiel. The bad news is that we don't have the record of everything that rabbi wrote. That's the bad news. The good news is the Talmud gives us bits and pieces of how to consolidate, in other words, to make peace between what Ezekiel writes and what the Torah writes. In general, what we're going to try to do is there's really two approaches. And as we go through the verses, I'm going to try to show you both approaches. But in general, here's what we're going to say. The underlying problem here is that in this Haftorah, there's more restrictions on the Kohanim than there are in the Torah. So, and also more restrictions. Also, some of the laws that in the Torah apply to the high priests, in this Haftorah apply to all priests. You see the problem? The problem is that what the Torah says about the high priests, this Haftorah says about the priests. That's the general problem. The other small minor problems, that's the big problem. So there are two ways of solving the problem. One way is what Rashi does. Rashi reads the verses, puts commas in different places, and he allows the reading of this Haftorah to be consistent with the Torah. So there's no change. Everything is fine. It just takes a little bit of changing. In other words, you're dividing the verse in half. One clause, you say one clause is referring to one thing, the other clause is talking about something else, and you solve the problem. So that's one general way. That's what Rashi is going to do, consistently with all the discrepancies between our parsha and the Haftorah. But then there are other approaches, like the Radak, Rav David Kinchi, who was a great commentator on the Bible. And the Radak and others that follow him say, no, it's not doing what Rashi says. Here, it does seem that the priests are more like the high priests, but it's not because the law changes, but it's because when Mashiach comes, part of what Ezekiel is trying to say is that there's going to be a spiritual upgrade in the Jewish people. And therefore, the priests themselves will also act in a way more befitting to the high priest. So that's how he reinterprets everything. In other words, it's not a contradiction to the Torah, either because it's saying exactly what the Torah is saying, that's what Rashi will help us do, or because no, the priests, even though they don't have to in the Torah, but the priests are going to actually be elevated and raise themselves to the state of the high priest as a result of the Messianic era. So these are the two general approaches, and we'll show how it works and how they do it. And again, the big idea here is that according to Ezekiel is saying that we have this third temple, which in some sense is going to be greater than the first two. So that elevation is expressed also in the sense that the priests are going to be elevated to a higher level. This is consistent with the Kabbalah. The Zohar says this as well, that in some sense the Levites become priests and the priests become high priests. So there's a certain spiritual elevation. So this is by way of introduction. Any questions or comments, please share. And then we're going to open that. And as we do that, we'll open the Haftorah and share the screen. Of course, I don't have my phone. My phone is dead. So I'll have to peek at the notes from time to time. But for now, we'll start with the Haftorah and hope I remember at least something. Haftorah, here we go. So we were referring to, this is Ezekiel again, Ezekiel Yecheskel chapter 44, verse 15. So again, in the previous verses, in the previous chapters, he's discussing the temple, of the third temple. And after the discussion, now he says about, okay, who's going to serve in the third temple? So I'm going to read, we'll begin to read and we'll see what happens. But the priests, the Levites, in other words, the Levites are, the priests are a family within the tribe of Levi. So the priests, the Levites, the sons of Tzadok, who kept the charge of my sanctuary when the children of Israel went astray from me, they shall come near to me to minister to me, and they shall stand before me to offer me fat and blood, says the Lord God. So who's Tzadok? The priests, the Levites, the sons of Tzadok. Tzadok is a high priest that lived 400 years earlier in the time of David and also Solomon. And ultimately, he was one of the high priests that remained loyal to David even when initially there was Tzadok and Aviatar. There were two priests, but then Tzadok was loyal to David in the time of the rebellion of his son Avshalom against David, and therefore he was loyal to Solomon as well, and therefore he was the first high priest to be in the temple, and that's who Tzadok was. But also his descendants remained loyal to God even after much of the Jewish people went astray after idol worship, and therefore the children of Tzadok, they will be within the priests, they will be the family that will stand before me, says God, to offer the offerings. That's 16. They shall enter my sanctuary, and they shall approach my table to minister to me, and they shall keep my charge. They shall guard Mishmartim, guard the guard. In other words, they should be in charge of the service. Now we get into some problems here. Verse 17, we go crashing into a problem. I'm going to read 17 and 18. And it shall be, when they enter the gates of the inner court, they shall be clothed with linen garments, and no wool shall be upon them when they minister the gates of the inner court and within. Linen hats shall be upon their heads, and linen breeches shall be upon their loins. They shall not gird themselves in a place that sweats. So they have to wear linen. And it also tells you how the garment should be. So loyakur bayaza, which means they don't gird themselves in a place that sweats. They have to put the belt lower than the underarms. So it's telling you the placement of the garment. Okay, what is the problem here? The problem here is as follows. The problem here is that if you look at the Torah, you see that the Torah, the priests actually do have semer. They do have wool. Because within the garments of the high priest, there's tchelet, there's turquoise blue wool. And here it says that the high priests, and here it says the priests coming will not wear wool, they'll only wear linen. Problem number one. Problem number one, ladies and gentlemen. So let's solve the problem very quickly. I'm just going to take a peek because just going to take a peek here to make sure I don't mislead you. Okay, so this is not so hard to solve. If you're Rashi, remember we have two general ways of solving the problem. One way is to reinterpret the verse to make it consistent with what the Torah is saying. The other way is to say that this is an upgrade because of the future redemption. So we start with Rashi. Says Rashi, we're talking about not the common priests. We're talking about the high priest on Yom Kippur. The high priest on Yom Kippur. So during the year, the high priest wore not 4 garments but 8 garments, and that certainly had wool. But on Yom Kippur, the white garments of the high priest had only flax, only linen. So verse 17 and 18, according to Rashi, is referring to the high priests on Yom Kippur. Problem solved. No contradiction with the words of the Torah. You have any Rashis here? Show Rashi's commentary. Read Rashi. And no wool shall be upon them. They shall not wear the blue wool that was in the robe and girdle on the day of atonement during the service in the inner court on Yom Kippur, when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies. Because on Yom Kippur, the high priest actually changed his garments many times. He changes his garments from wearing his regular garments, 8 garments, which certainly did include wool. But when he went into the Holy of Holies, he wore only cotton, only linen, white linen. So that's what the verse is saying, according to Rashi. When it says, and it shall be when they enter the gates of the inner court. So Rashi says that's talking about Yom Kippur. High priest on Yom Kippur, and therefore Rashi solves the problem. We're not referring to any contradiction with what the Torah says. Again, the Radak disagrees. The Radak says that the high priests that the priests, we're not referring to the high priests. We're talking about. See, the problem is it says plural. It says when they enter the gates of the inner court. So Rashi says they is the collective high priests. Every year when they enter. But it's a little bit of a problem because it says plural. So Radak prefers to say we're talking about all the priests. When the priest would enter enter the inner chamber, not the Holy of Holies, but he would enter the ark, enter the holy, not the Holy of Holies, sort of the inner chamber, but not the innermost chamber. According to Radak, when Mashiach comes as a sign of higher, more intense holiness, they will also wear the white linen garments of the high priests. Now we continue. 19. But when they go out to the outer court, into the outer court of the people, they shall put off their garments wherein they minister and place them in the chambers belonging to the sanctuary and clothe themselves with other garments, and they shall not sanctify the people with their garments. In other words, the garments that they wear, the high priest's garments, must remain within a holy place. It can't go out to the common people. Okay, next. And the hair of their heads they are not to shave, but also not to let it grow wild. They must be careful to trim the hair of their heads. So you want to have a haircut so the priests look fine. 21, and wine may no priest drink when they come into the inner courts. Okay, next problem. And verse 22 is a problem again. And neither a widow nor a divorced woman may they take for wives, but they shall take virgins from the descendants of the house of Israel. Also the widow who is only a widow, oh my God, Okay, so there's different ways of interpreting this. The simple way of interpreting this: a widow who's a widow of a priest, the priest may marry. They may marry. Okay, so why am I saying that this verse is a problem? Because why am I saying the verse is a problem? Because if you look at the Torah in this week's portion, it works like this: a priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee. A priest is allowed to marry a widow. A high priest cannot marry a widow. Right? So almanah, a widow, a high priest can't marry a widow. So here we have the same problem. Neither a widow nor a divorced woman may they take for wives. Sounds like all the priests can't marry a widow. That contradicts the Torah. So again, Rashi would say the first clause of this verse is referring not to the priests, but to the high priests. Radak would say, no. Radak would say, again, when Mashiach comes, the priests will do will be closer, more similar to the high priest, and therefore they too will follow the law of the high priests. Yes, go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a couple of questions. First of all, the interpretations of both of them, they're not so much different because it's an exception. Messianic era, it's a higher level, and
right.
high is the higher level. That's my first question. The second question is, does Kabbalah say anything about not wearing wool as being that coming from the animal?
Oh, so what's the idea? So let's deal with the first question first. I agree with you that they both agree the Messianic era is different, but the question is what they're disagreeing on the level of pshat. What is the verse saying? Who is the verse talking about? Is the verse talking about the priest or the high priest? And if you believe it's talking about the priest, you run into a problem. So then you have to say that the Mashiach comes, the priest will be extra careful and have more restriction, even though the Torah doesn't allude to it, which creates its own problems because the law of the Torah doesn't change. So maybe they're just adding an additional stringency, but it's not a changing of the Torah. So that creates all sorts of problems. According to Rashi, there's no problem to begin with. We're not talking about the priest. We're talking about the high priest. Now, your other question: what's the idea of flax? So, according to the Kabbalah, I don't know anything about flax, but according to the Kabbalah, the pishtan, the flax, each stalk grows by itself. In other words, you have one stalk and one kernel on one stalk, and I guess that's somehow unique, as opposed to other forms of wheat, for example, where you have multiple kernels in the same stalk. So according to the Kabbalah, the idea of oneness is represented within flax, the oneness. And therefore, the verse here says, and it's consistent with what the Kabbalah says elsewhere, when the high priest goes into the inner chamber, even in this verse, even if it's not the high priest, it's certainly when they go in, not when they go out. When they go in either inner or innermost. When they go to the innermost chamber, that is the metaphor, that's the space where you feel the oneness of Hashem. So the oneness of Hashem is more felt in your consciousness. So when we live in, we know Hashem Echad, we know the word God is one, but God is one according to the Kabbalah means not only that there's one God and there's no other gods. God is one means God is the only reality, because everything else I look at, the table, the chair, the wall, the house, the tree, all that is just divine energy creating it. So in reality, what looks like many different creations from the perspective of the Kabbalah, the inner perspective, from the level of the energy, all it is God's oneness. The problem is that I believe it. I cover my eyes every day and I say, Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Lord is one means there's only one, there's only the oneness. The problem is I have to cover my eyes, because when I uncover my eyes, I don't feel the oneness. And that's normal, that's okay. There's our perspective and there's the true perspective, and they're both legitimate. When I go into the Holy of Holies, when the priest goes into the Holy of Holies, or at least the Holy, if not the Holy of Holies, that is a place where the priest would sense the oneness of God. And there's no other anything else. You don't sense anything else other than the presence of God. And to represent that, according to the Kabbalah, that's what the pishtan, that's what the flax represents. Why flax? Because flax represents unity. Why unity? Because you got one stalk. That's what the Kabbalah says. So I could just convey, and then you now could expand it and explain it and apply it. So there is this space. In other words, the high priest going to the inner chamber is not just a geographical shift. It is a awareness shift. and therefore they would only wear that flax when they are in the holy, because outside it's very hard to see only the unity. It's probably impossible. So once a year you go into that space, just like once a day you cover your eyes and you say God is one. But the rest of the day you're living in the reality where you don't you feel the duality of creator and creation. But you know that once a year you go into the space where there is no duality, everything is creator.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Rabbi. And also the animal, the wool represents the other extreme, attachment to materialism.
It's different. Yeah, it could be that semer would be more animalistic. I don't know. That I'm not 100% sure about. But what I said about the flax, that is clear in the Kabbalah.
Do they also talk about it being the animal soul?
I don't know. That's my guess. That's my guess, but I don't know. I don't know for sure. There can also be, I don't know enough about this, but it can also be related to Cain and Hevel, where Cain's gift, according to Rashi, it says he brought from the fruit of the ground. According to Rashi, he brought pishtan, he brought flax, and Hevel brought sheep. But sheep, the metaphor for sheep is the sheep produces wool. And in fact, when it comes to the mitzvah, there is a mitzvah of kilayim. There is a mitzvah that you're not allowed to mix wool and flax. And the only exception may be the priest in the temple, because they wore both, according to some opinions. But in any case, generally speaking, you can't wear flax and wool together in the same garment. And what is the reason? There's no reason. It's a chok, it's a decree. But the Kabbalah's reason is because you cannot mix the gift of Cain and the gift of Hevel, the energy of Cain, the energy of Hevel. And even though in this world Cain was worse, but in its source, Cain killed his brother, Cain is worse, but in the source, Cain is from a higher source. And therefore, Cain brings the flax is a higher source. So in some sense, that separate the idea of wool would represent Hevel, which in this world is more holy, but it's not as superior in its source. And now we're getting into a little bit beyond what my expertise, but I know that the Arizal talks about the different families of Tzadok, of the different families within the priests, as some descending from Cain and some descending from Hevel. And in some periods of history, one family was the primary priestly family. In other words, the high priesthood was with one family, and then it shifts. And I'm pretty sure when Mashiach comes, it shifts back to Cain. Because remember, Cain is actually the firstborn. So Cain is the souls of the priests that are reincarnated. The souls of Cain that are reincarnated into priests, they really have a higher source, which, again, is beyond my expertise, but touching upon what Vicky asked, I think Vicky asked on last Sunday or a different Sunday, you asked, is there reincarnation from before the Jewish people? I think you asked that, if I'm not mistaken. And I think I said, yeah, was that your question? I think so, right?
Yeah, that was about the Exodus people who didn't.
So I said before the giving of the Torah, there may have been some, I don't know, but I guess there was, but I don't know if it was across the board. And here you have a reference in the Cain and Hevel soul, certainly were reincarnated later into the priests. But again, I don't know too much about this. I have to go back and check the sources in the Sha'ar HaGilgulim of the Arizal. But it is interesting that the question of flax over wool right away takes you back to Cain and Hevel according to the Kabbalah. And Cain, although he kills his brother and is a bad guy, but he's trying to connect to that oneness. And that oneness is the flax. And the problem is sometimes when you try to get too lofty, you end up killing your brother. In other words, he wasn't balanced in this world. So that was part of the problem, that you have to have that running and returning. Just to run and escape and try to seek the oneness, ultimately that's not going to get you. You can't be there all year. You have to go into that space, but you also have to exit that space safely.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, this was way more Kabbalah than we meant to do in a Haftorah class, but it's all good. Wonderful. Now, what else did the priests do? The priests at 23, and my people shall they teach the difference between holy and profane and cause them to discern between the impure and pure. One of the jobs the priests would do is they were like the rabbis, they taught. Now, you don't have to be a priest to be a rabbi. And you'll see later the 24, that's 324. And in dispute, they shall stand in judgment. According to my ordinances shall they decide. And my teachings and my statutes shall they keep in all my appointed times, and my Shabbats they shall sanctify. So we see here in the beginning of 24 that they, the priests, they stand in judgment when it comes to the dispute. So in other words, it sounds like they are the judges, but it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to be a judge you have to be a priest to be a judge. You could be any tribe. But the point here is this is just practical because the priests have extra time in their hands, because they don't have fields to work, because as we will see later, that they don't get a portion in the land. So practically speaking, many of the people of the Sanhedrin just happened to be priests because the priests had more time dedicated to study. So that's why the verse implies that the priests are the ones who stand in judgment, even though they don't have to, but practically speaking, there was a disproportionate amount of priests on the high court. 25, to no human corpse shall they come to defile themselves, except to father and to mother and to son, to daughter, to brother and to sister who has no husband, shall they defile themselves. Again, that's consistent with what the Torah says about the priests. And after his purification, they shall count seven days for him. And here is a funny verse, 27. Again, this is a little bit inconsistent, and I'll show you how Rashi and Radak deal with it. And on the day that he enters the sanctuary, into the inner court to minister in the sanctuary, he shall offer his sin offering, says the Lord God. Okay, what is the problem here? The problem here is that there's no record that you have to, when you come into the temple after being impure, you have to bring an offering. And it sounds like 27 is a continuation to 26, that after you become impure, you count 7 days, and you get the blood of the ashes of the red heifer, and then you go into the temple and bring an offering, but we don't know of any offering. So that's why we read 27. Rashi reads 27 and says this is a different commandment, a commandment that we read in the book of Exodus, in the book of Leviticus, the second portion in Sav. And there it says the first time, well, it alludes to it at least, the first time any priest comes to do the to serve in the temple, the first time he offers the inauguration offering for any priest, he would bring a meal offering, and that's what verse 27 is referring to according to Rashi. 28, it shall be to them for an inheritance. I am their inheritance. You shall give them no possession in Israel. I am their possession. In other words, every tribe in Israel gets a portion of the land, except for the priests. The priests don't get a portion in the land. So what's their inheritance? God says, I'm their inheritance. What does that mean? It means that the gifts that the people come to bring to God in the temple, that goes to the priests, as we will discuss in 29. The meal offerings and the sin offerings and the guilt offerings that they to eat, and everything that is vowed to be banned in Israel shall belong to them. So they translate cherem as ban, but cherem is a word if you want to dedicate something to God. If you say I'm dedicating my house to God, then it goes to the priests. So the priests don't have a portion in Israel because God is their portion, meaning whatever's given to God goes to them. And verse 30 continues to talk about the gifts that we give to God, the gift to God and the priests get. And one of them he's going to mention is the famous one of challah, that you give the first piece of dough to the priest. And there's a beautiful blessing that when you give the beginning to God, it gives you blessing and it fills the whole home with blessing. Very beautiful verse. And the first of the first fruits, that's the bikurim, when you bring when a Jew would supposed to bring his first fruits to God of the harvest of that year, bring the first fruit, that would go to the priests. And every heave offering, in other words, the beginning of the truma of the produce, everything from every sort of your heave offering shall belong to the priests. Also, this is the challah, the first out of your kneading throws, I don't know what that word is, shall you give to the priest. In other words, the beginning of the kneading, the beginning of the dough, you give to the priest as challah. And this is beautiful verse to bring enduring blessing into your home. When you give the first portion of your dough to God, represents that you realize that God is first online, because God is the source of your blessing. So when you recognize that God is the source of your blessing and you do the mitzvah of challah, that fills your home with blessing, that leaves the enduring blessing in your home. And then we have another problem. This is a big problem. This almost caused them to bury the whole book. Anything that had died or of itself or is fatally wounded, whether it be a bird or beast, the priests may not eat. Nevela means it died without ritual slaughter. Fatally wounded literally means an animal that you're not allowed to slaughter because it's gravely ill. That's the word for treif. Treif means that Treif doesn't mean not kosher. Treif means it's used that way. Treif means an animal that was devoured. If it was devoured by an animal of prey, even if it's still alive, but because it's soon going to die, you're not allowed to slaughter it. So 31 is a big problem because 31 says that the priests are not allowed to eat a bird or an animal that have not been slaughtered properly. Why is that a big problem? Because the priests, what about the rest of Israel? Nobody's allowed to eat that. Why does it imply that only the priests cannot, but the rest of Israel can? And this was such a big problem that they almost buried the book because of this. So what's the solution? Let's see Rashi's solution. I hope he comes up with a good one. I'm in suspense. Since nipping the neck of the bird sin offering was permitted, which is tantamount to an animal that died of itself or was fatally wounded, since it is not the normal method of slaughter, he had to warn them concerning eating other creatures that died of themselves or were fatally wounded. So our sages explain. That's what the Talmud explains. Basically, what the issue is like this. What Rashi is telling us is as follows. There is a specific, there was a specific bird offering in the temple that the priests would offer, but the bird offering was an exception. The way they would slaughter it is not with a knife through the neck, which is the normal way of slaughtering an animal or a bird, but when they brought the bird to the temple, the way they would do it, I hate to ruin your morning, but the priest would do it with his nail. They would make sure the nail is sharp. They would kill the bird with their fingernail, and they would do it not from the neck, but from the back of the neck, from the nape. That was called milika. And that in the Torah says to do that. Now that's an exception. That technically is treif. That technically is not, it's not kosher, was not been slaughtered. But there's an exception that the priest is allowed to eat from the bird that was offered in the temple in that way. Says Rashi, what is Ezekiel telling you? That a priest may not eat an animal that has not been slaughtered properly. Because we may mistake. We may think if the priest is allowed to eat the bird that was slaughtered, that was killed through milika in the temple, maybe the priest doesn't have to eat through ritual slaughter. That's why it has to be specifically reiterated that even the priest who, in certain circumstances in the ritual service in the temple, eats the bird who was not slaughtered properly, nevertheless, except for that exception, the rule stays the same. They cannot eat any nevela, any animal that died or animal that was fatally wounded.
Rabbi, can I ask you a quick question? I mean, logically, there is no problem with pshat because the verse doesn't say anything about the rest of Israel.
Correct. That's a fine answer, but not everybody is sophisticated. People are looking for ways out. So if you're just a common Jew and you hear priests cannot eat treif, say wonderful. So the priests won't go to the treif restaurant. I will, right? So you have to be careful. That's what the sages say in the Ethics of the Fathers. The Chachamim, this wise people have to be careful with what they say because it's the responsibility of the prophet not to leave room for someone to make a big mistake, especially if people want to make the mistake, right? People want to eat in a not kosher restaurant. So here we say, if you tell me, oh, the priests can't eat treif, I say, that's wonderful. Thank God I'm not a priest. I'm going to make my next reservation, right? So, but the point here is that we say, no, the reason why we iterate specifically about the priest, but you're right, it's not a real question. The problem is the perception is the problem. You're right, it's not a real, it's unlike before that was a real contradiction. This is not a real contradiction. This is a question of perception. But perception is so powerful, they were going to bury it specifically because of this verse. Other reasons too, but this verse is one of the main causes.
Thank you.
Okay, one more idea. Now that we read it inside, one more idea, just a general idea that talks about what's happening here is, it seems that, especially according to Rashi, to Radak, when Mashiach comes, even the common priests are going to, when they enter the inner chamber, not the innermost, but the inner chamber, they will be more like the high priest, and they will wear the white linen garments that the high priest wears on Yom Kippur. Okay, so what's the takeaway? What's the message that Ezekiel is trying to portray? Ezekiel is trying to portray that there's some relationship between the rebuilding of the temple when Mashiach comes and Yom Kippur, because on Yom Kippur is when the high priest wore the linen garments. Okay, so what we're saying is restoring the temple in the Mashiach times after the bitter exile is like Yom Kippur. What's Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is reiterating and reestablishing the love between God and the Jewish people. Because during the year there's betrayal, during the year there's sin, and Yom Kippur is that restating of the vows through the forgiveness and restoring the love. That's really what Yom Kippur is about. So similarly, after 2,000 years of exile, which there's a lot of betrayal on both ways, right? We feel like God abandoned us. I'm sure God feels like we abandoned him. But we're saying the rebuilding of the temple is like Yom Kippur. That's the healing. That is proving that the bond was always there, and that's restating the vows and bringing the purification for the exile. So what Yom Kippur is for the whole year, the rebuilding of the temple is for the exile. That's the story in short. Thank you for joining, and may this be for the elevation of the soul of Elisa's mother, and only good news.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.